Our topic tonight is Toward a Truly Free Market, a Distributist Perspective. And as we go along, you're going to see that our participants are muted and videos are off, but we definitely welcome your questions. So there is the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And if you have a question as going through our presentation, please feel free to enter it there, and we'll have a period of question and answers a little bit later. So to give a couple of words about global responsibility, the host of tonight's session. First, welcome back to those who have participated before. So if you're joining us for the first time, we are an international organization founded about a decade ago, centered around the cause of human dignity and common good, and working to promote these principles in the civic political realm. And we see evidence all around us of the urgent need of these principles to guide civic and political life. So we really hope that tonight's session will be another tool to help us better understand what do these principles mean, what do they ask of us, and where might we apply them and really build a better world. So global responsibility works through formation and action activities. First, we want to understand what truly upholds human dignity and what really is the common good. And then we want to take action to pursue these ideals in our environments. So we created this webinar series called The Common Good in the Public Square, which is what you're all here for tonight. And the idea behind this webinar series, we start with formation. So learning about a topic. Some topics may be familiar, some may be completely new, and all of it is valuable to learn. Then we take what we've learned and really get engaged on the topic with further research and discussion. So if anything about tonight inspires you to ask more questions, to dig a little deeper, you get an idea for something you might be able to do, then the other piece of that is action, is activation. Definitely encouraged, optional, but really our hope is that the action comes as an extension of our conviction about the importance of these principles that we're talking about and learning about. So we organized tonight's presentation and this whole Common Good in the Public Square series to follow this model of formation, analysis and dissemination, and activation. So you can check out our website for some of the other projects that we're involved in, because the Common Good in the Public Square webinar series is one of many things that global responsibility lends our energy to. So there's more on our website about other organizations we're involved with and support, and then also check out our Facebook page and I believe our website as well for more information about the earlier webinars in this series if you were not able to join for those. So now, moving on to the highlight of our evening, I want to introduce our speaker, who we are so grateful to have with us tonight. And I'm pleased to introduce John Madai, who's going to talk on the topic Toward a Truly Free Market, a Distributist Perspective. So I'll read a quick bio. John Madai has been an adjunct instructor at the University of Dallas for the past 16 years, where he teaches courses on social justice for business students and introduction to the Bible. But he came to academia late in life after 40 years in the business world. He has done 2 combat tours in Vietnam, served 5 terms on his local city council, including 1 term as mayor pro tem, and is the author of 3 books: The Vocation of Business, Social Justice in the Marketplace, Toward a Truly Free Market, a Distributive Perspective, and Theology, Logos, or Mythos with Tom Stork. He is currently working on a 4th book on free will, faith, and fate. He has been married for 49 years and is the father of 5 and the grandfather of 3 rather grandchildren. John Madai, we thank you so much for being here tonight, and I now turn the floor over to you.
Well, Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and I'm very, very proud honored to participate in this. And so I'd like to start giving a hopefully not overlong presentation, just kind of an overview of distributism, why we need it, and what we can do with it. And so that'll be kind of a 30,000-foot view, and then we can get down to specifics, I think, in the question and answer period. So why distributism? And in that, I'd like to start with talking about if it ain't broke. I mean, if capitalism is doing fine, why replace it? And then I'll talk about the 4 great mistakes that current theory makes. And then I'll talk about property, which is at the heart of distributism. It's what it primarily distributes. And then finally, the paths to recovery. So if it ain't broke, after all, capitalism brings us prosperity, does it not? Well, there are some realities we need to think about. So capitalism justifies itself because it produces enormous piles of goods, absolutely. And it makes everybody richer, at least that's the claim. And we live longer. Well, we certainly do live longer. And markets are freer. Well, again, that's a claim. And we just need to restrict government and everything will be fine. The realities are otherwise. There are vast disparities in wealth and poverty. It produces the goods, but it really can't distribute them. Not only that, capitalism dislocates traditional families, traditional communities, traditional economic systems, the environment, governments, nations. And far from being a small government or free market theory, the historical fact is that the growth of capitalism is always accompanied by the expansion of government and the collectivization of the economy. In fact, it's the end of free markets. Wherever capitalism advances, the free market retreats. The benefits that they talk about largely come from government investments. So people do live a lot longer. They live a lot longer, however, largely because of the public health officer, because of the extensive infrastructures in drainage systems, in water distribution systems, in health systems, etc. The system itself is largely dependent upon usury, that is consumer debt, and the government being the biggest spender as the consumer of last resort. Well, why is this? Well, there's 4 great mistakes that capitalism makes. There's an economic mistake, a political mistake, then I want to talk about the human mistake and the social mistake. So, economic mistake. It actually begins with the name economics itself. This was a science totally unknown to man prior to the end of the 19th century. Before that, from the time of Aristotle forward, you had what was called political economy. And the difference is crucial because with economics is supposed to be a standalone science, like physics, like chemistry, something like that. Okay, but in fact, such an economics doesn't exist. It's always embedded in political, social, and ethical systems and cannot be discussed apart from those systems. Now, you find out there's really only 2 formulas for all the complex mathematics that they cite. They're all based on 2 formulas, supply and demand and marginal utility. Well, within supply and demand, I'll start with supply and demand, both are treated as independent variables which are resolved with linear equations. So you've seen this chart 1,000 times, right? Nice, neat, straight lines with a clear equilibrium point. Anybody can understand it. However, It simply isn't accurate. Because both supply and demand are codependent variables, and they're resolved with differential equations. And differential equations do not produce those nice straight lines. Differential equations produce all sorts of strange charts, like this one, for example. So what do you think our economy more looks like? This nice, neat chart here, or these more complex charts? The truth is, supply and demand are dependent. They represent the overall division of rewards between suppliers and demanders. That is, if suppliers take more in rewards, then demanders must get less. And vice versa, if demanders get more, suppliers get less. They're codependent. They're not standalone. You could put it this way. Each firm's wage bill is every other firm's demand curve. The money you get in wages is what you use to support other businesses. Well, there's a political mistake as well. This is not a mathematical science. It's a humane science. And humane sciences have a very different character because each humane science has a telos. So medicine is a humane science. It has a telos, a human purpose of health. And it's this telos, this purpose is how you judge the success or failure of a system within a humane science. So the telos of economics is the material provisioning of society. Its purpose is to provide the material base for strong families and communities. And on that standard, and that standard alone, success or failure of an economy must be measured, not by growth in GDP, which is the standard that they use. GDP can grow while society actually declines. Then there's the human mistake, because marginal utility treats all humans as utility maximizers. Treats them as pure individuals with no binding connections. And self-interest is treated as the only motivation. But humans exist in societies. And we also maximize things like love, self-respect, beauty. Sometimes we act for self-interest, and sometimes we must act purely for self-interest. But other times we act for self-respect. We act because we have obligations to our families and our communities. And a science which excludes that can't really be called a science. It's interesting that no other science accepts the economist's view of the human person. So if you get into the behavioral sciences, they tell you that the human person is a lot more complex than what the economists will grant. And there's the social mistake. You'll notice how often these debates come down to, are framed as being socialism versus capitalism. But in fact, neither socialism nor capitalism exist independently of each other, and never have. All markets, without exception, depend upon a base of common goods, of socialized goods. Think about it. It doesn't matter how good you are at making a product. If there are no roads to take it to market, you will not be successful. If every entrepreneur had to dig his own latrine, drill his own well, educate his own customers and employees, provide his own security, ensure the safety of his own food supply, he just wouldn't have time to spend with his business. He depends on these things being in place. So there's physical and political infrastructures, property rights, laws, courts, etc. But the most important infrastructure is that social capital. Socialism needs markets to be funded, but markets need socialism, here referring to socialized goods, to exist at all. So the real question is not socialism versus capitalism, but which goods should be market goods and which goods should be common goods or socialized goods. So we can recognize that roads probably should be socialized. Should healthcare be socialized? Okay, that's the kind of debate that we need to have. Okay, I'm going to move on then to the question of property. We talk about property with culture and economics. The question of private versus public property. The 5 types of property, and collectives and co-ops. Let's start with the economic truth that all production is dependent upon 2 factors: the gifts of nature and the labor of man. That's it. There's nothing else. Well, some will say, well, you need capital. Yes, but capital is always the result of prior labor. So you have a hammer, which is an item of capital, a tool. You only have it because somebody made it, combining labor and the gifts of nature in a prior period. So there's only these 2 factors. Now, culture always begins with agriculture. Matter of fact, pretty much everything does. So here's the real progression of culture and property. We always start in tribal societies, and tribal societies always start with communal and personal property. Okay? Now, I'll get to these terms a little bit deeper, in the next slide. We pretty much always then move on to aristocratic societies, where the personal property becomes privatized, and often the communal property, the commons, also becomes privatized and becomes the private property of some sort of overclass. In the early capitalist phase, this private property becomes absolutized. So aristocratic societies kind of treat property as a competition between aristocrats, but in the early capitalism, private property becomes an absolute and unlimited right. The final stage is capitalism and communism. Now, may be surprised to put those 2 together, but the reason will become apparent in a minute. But in truth, both are combinations of private and collective property. So the distribution of property dictates the character of society. And it also dictates its politics and its economics. Well, our current conversation is always about private versus public property. So it's a very, very flattened discussion, as I hope to show. It doesn't really take into account the real history and the real varieties of property. And the modern discussion starts with what I call the Lockean myth. And John Locke is the great philosopher of modern property. And according to Locke, the land is originally settled by individuals, and by first working the land, a person acquires that land as private property. And that's the end of the question. The reality is otherwise. Property, communities, or lands are always settled by communities, never by just lone individuals. Matter of fact, it's almost impossible for that to be the case. Now, these communities are usually following an army. They're coming on in wagon trains, following some sort of military conquest, or they may themselves be the military conquest. And so the grim truth about all property is that it is always dependent upon the right of conquest. So I am sitting on this hill because the Americans took it from the Mexicans, who took it from the Spanish, who took it from the Apache, who took it from the Mandan, who took it from whatever group originally occupied the property. And that is true of every parcel of property on the face of the earth. It all depends on the right of conquest. Now, originally, the community allocates land to families based on some standard. For small communities, that's always going to be for the health of the family and the community. For large empires, it's going to be large grants of land to reward followers. Now, for communities, this is personal property. That is, it's given to persons for a limited need, the need of supporting their family and contributing to the community. But this personal property becomes then what we know as private property, which becomes absolute, no longer connected to the community, no longer having duties and obligations to the community. It should be noted here, I'm a Catholic and I teach at a Catholic university. For Catholics, private property in Catholic teaching has always been a relative right, has never been an absolute right. So from this little history, we can see that there are 5 types of property. So all property begins as communal, either from first settlement or from the right of conquest. The community allocates properties to families or individuals, and this is personal property, given to them for purpose important to the community. This property becomes private property, eventually over time. And this becomes an unlimited right. There are no limits on acquisition. Okay? So in theory, one person or group could own it all. And in actual fact, one relatively small group, maybe 1% of the population, owns the commanding heights of the economy. But eventually, see, they really don't own it anymore as private property. They own it as collective property. That is, it's almost impossible to own it as private property because you couldn't manage that much property. It has to be collectivized. So in fact, most of the things we buy today do not come from private property. They come from vast corporate collectives where ownership and use are widely separated. So for example, in my retirement portfolio, I have dozens and dozens of companies. It's incorrect to say that I own these companies. In fact, I don't even know what most of these companies are or what they do. Okay, I have no personal responsibility for them. They are collectivized properties run by professional managers. Personal property, however, develops in another way. It develops or can develop into cooperatives. I should also mention that these 5 types don't exhaust it because there are artificial types of property. So intellectual property, for example, clearly a creation of the government. Equities are a way of distributing rewards from the collectivized companies like corporations. Leases, things like that. All of those are legal entities, but they're not really natural property. And that brings us to the question of collectives and co-ops. Collectives, whether state collectives or as in the Soviet Union, or private collectives such as an American corporation, have remote owners who may not at all have any connection with that property other than their equity, and top-down control. All authority flows from the top. And this creates a managerial class and managerial overhead. And this managerial class becomes the real power, certainly within that collective, but also throughout society. Cooperatives, on the other hand, are the opposite. They deal with personal owners, people who are contributing their personal property and are using that personal property along with other personal property owners who have joined in the cooperative. And the control here, authority here, is from the bottom up, is from the workers towards management, and not the other way around. So you have control by actual users of the property. Well, the goal then of distributism is to make most men property owners and therefore free. Because our belief is that freedom is not just a matter of political freedom, but of economic freedom. And for most people, only property confers economic freedom. Property confers freedom. The vote is never enough. Now, the state will always come to reflect the property system. If it's a state where property is owned mainly by oligarchs, it will be an oligarchic state. If it's owned by aristocrats, it'll be an aristocratic state. But if property is well spread throughout the community, it will become a democratic state. So, distributism aims at a system where most property, not necessarily all, but most property is personal property or cooperative property. So, how do we get there from here? I'm going to talk about public policy, land redistribution, why distributism, and then co-ops, ESOPs, and co-management. Public policy. What public policies could lead to this? All right, I'll make a few suggestions here, and I'm sure others have other ideas. One, we could simply enforce the antitrust laws. That would be nice. Break up the monopolies. When a few companies have control of the market, break them up. I mean, that doesn't require anything new but following existing law. Well, we have to have monopolies. We should treat them as public monopolies. So the Amazon, for example, is a great tool for small sellers to sell their property, sell their products, but they take a 15% cut, right? Which is a tremendous burden on the small businessman. Is that the right cut? I don't know. But I think when you're as big as Amazon and have that much control, the public ought to have some input on that decision. That is, they should be regulated as public utilities. Now, of course, Facebook, Twitter, and that question is becoming, come to the fore in the area of censorship, since they have denied our president a forum anymore. Well, questions like that are not just corporate questions, I believe, but are also public policy questions. Okay, what else can we do? And as much as possible, the subsidizing of business. Now, capitalism claims to be free market. In fact, it depends on vast amounts of subsidies. But I want to take one subsidy that's so common, we miss it. We don't see it. We're too used to it. And that's the highway subsidy. In fact, our road taxes, our gas taxes do not pay for the highways. They have to be highly subsidized. This means that heavy users of that system do not pay the full cost of the freight. Well, you could not have an entity like the big box store, like Walmart, unless you had a subsidized transportation system. The highway system, the port system, the air traffic system, all highly subsidized. If they really paid the full cost of transportation, Walmart would not be competitive. And you'll notice that Walmart always springs up along the side of freeways because they need to transport a vast number of customers there and have a vast parking lot. Okay, without the freeway, you don't have Walmart. But what's true of Walmart is true of the economy generally. Globalization works largely by subsidy. So if there were weight and distance tolls on the so-called freeway system, what you would do is force localization, force regionalization of the economy. Right now, you can have your goods made in the interior of China, put on a truck to take to Shanghai, put on a boat to take to Long Beach, put on a train to take to Bentonville, Arkansas, put on a truck to take to the regional warehouse house centers, put on another truck to deliver to the stores. Okay. That only works. You can only have such a long supply chain if it's subsidized. You end that subsidy and you end the big box store. Okay, and you'll see the rise of the small businessman again. So we would like to force localization. Well, force perhaps isn't the right word, but we'd like to encourage localization and regionalization of the economy. I would suggest lower taxes and lighter regulation for employee-owned companies. So a company, for example, that is owned by its employees, I think provides a social benefit to the community. And therefore, it doesn't need to be taxed at the same rate as, say, does a large corporation. Now, what that differential should be is always up for debate. But also on regulation. If the employees really are free to set their own work rules, we may assume that the employees are looking out for each other and will not do anything to harm each other. And they do not have to have the same safety and health regulations that, say, a corporation does, where the temptation is to make rules to maximize profit. So they should enjoy lighter taxes, lighter regulation. I think it's also important to return to progressive taxation. Now that's somewhat controversial, but progressive taxation, we had a long experience with it and it worked. It worked to distribute property and to equalize wages. So for example, take a look at this chart. So this is the percent of wealth, percent of property that was owned by the top 10% within these various countries. So we have at the top here, the United States, this is France, this is Sweden, Europe as a whole, and here's the United States. This is Britain at the top. So in 1900, 10% of the people owned 80% of the property. That's real property and equities, things like that. 80%. And that was still below what the rest of these countries had. Largely through the influence of war, it was necessary to impose progressive taxation because they had to raise money to finance two rather expensive wars. Okay, and look what happened with progressive taxation. The share of the top decile, the top 10% plummeted. And so by 1980 in the 1985 in the United States, it was down to what that looks like about 62, 63%. But in Europe, which followed these policies a lot more closely than we did, the top 1% share shrunk to the 50% range. Now, since the 80s, since the Reaganomics, the share of the 10% is rising again in the United States. So they're back up now to in excess of 70% of all property. Europe, it's rising as well, but not as fast as in the United States. And look at income inequality, okay? So again, let's see, here's the United States in 1900. This is the share of the top 1%, the share of income of the top 1%. So 1% in 1900, the top 1% got about 16, 17% of all income. It was still better than Britain, where they got 25% of all income. In America, just before the Great Depression, it rose to 28, well, here on this chart, 23%. Okay. 23% of the income went to 1% of the people. But that declined. Under the influence of progressive taxation, you had this great compression. And the share of the top 1%, went down to a little more than 12%. Well, that's not an unreasonable decision or division, okay? This is a much more equal society. Now this, right in here, this great compression was the society of my youth. That's what I grew up with. And the rich and the poor in those days were a lot closer together than they are today. But look what's happened since market liberalism came back into fashion with Reagan and Thatcher. So it's risen again to the top 1% now get in excess of 20% of all income, and rising, and rising. I would say socially and politically, that is simply not a tenable situation. And I believe it explains a lot of what we see in politics today. I think a large portion of the population, both on the left and on the right, both the Bernie bro and the Trumpster, okay, feel that things are just not fair, that they don't have an equal shot, that it's tilted toward the rich. And you know what? They're absolutely right. Another possibility is land redistribution. Now this is very controversial because we have a lot of experience with that. We have experience with expropriation. You just, so take it from Tanya and give it to Rodrigo. This almost never works out, but it still works out better than what the World Bank recommends and finances, which are just market buyouts. But market buyouts really do not change distributions. It just changes the form of property, not the fact of property. So what does work? Well, let me take an example that worked very well, the land to the tiller program of Taiwan. This is a kind of partial expropriation and partial market buyout. So the old owners had to sell their property at a fraction of its market value. And under this program, nearly 500,000 families received their own land. It's the land they used to work as tenant farmers, paying 50% of the crop to the landlord. Well, they went from paying 50% of their crop to paying 25% for 10 years and then nothing. Then they just owned it outright. This led to a tremendous explosion of purchasing power at the bottom of society. How about the owners? Well, the owners got bonds to fund new businesses. They didn't get cash for their land, they got these bonds. And really the only thing you could do with these bonds, because they were worthless outside of Taiwan, was to use them as collateral for loans to start new businesses. Well, the old landlord class became a new business class because now there was lots of purchasing power to fund new businesses. So they not only had capital to start the business, they had customers with money in their pocket. You see how the two have to go together. Taiwan went from feudalism to becoming an industrial powerhouse in 1 generation, in 25 years. I know growing up in the 50s, we used to laugh at goods that said made in Taiwan because it meant, cheap and nasty. Well, by the 1970s, we weren't laughing anymore because the Taiwanese were kicking American ass in industry after industry, electronics, optics, cameras, steel, shipbuilding, etc., etc. Korea and Japan used the same program to rebuild after the war with pretty much the same results. So this is not pie in the sky. This is works. But the lesson, and I think this is the real lesson of distributism, society is always lifted from the bottom up, never the top down. All right, what else can you do? Well, co-ops. And the great example here, there's thousands of examples, but some of the most well-known are the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation of Spain, where there are 80,000 worker owners, and it has a 70-year track record. 70 years of constant expansion and of survival in good times and bad. The same can be said for the cooperative economy of Emilia-Romagna in Italy, which is about 100 years old or 150 years old, but it had to be rebuilt after Mussolini closed them down. And again, about 40%, 30 to 40% of the GDP of Emilia-Romagna comes from cooperatives. In the United States, we have something called the ESOP, the Employee Stock Ownership Plan, which is a way of bringing the workers into ownership of the company through stock options that are paid for with company profits. It's kind of a leveraged buyout of the company. The most famous example of this, again, there's thousands of them, but the Springfield Remanufacturing Company. And in Germany, Holland, and in other places, they use a technique called co-management. So in Germany, in big companies, the workers appoint half of the board of directors. In smaller companies, they appoint a third of the board of directors. This brings the workers into actual management and responsibility for the company. So I just point those out. Those are possibilities. Okay, so these are things on the ground working. You can look at it, kick the tires, see whether that's going to work for us, blah, blah, blah. So why distributism? The theory behind capitalism is that if we fund the rich, they will give us jobs out of the goodness of their hearts. The reality, capitalists or any sensible person only invest in markets with well-funded consumers. If there's not well-funded consumers, nobody's going to invest in that market. Free markets require real competition, and real competition requires that there be no monopolies or oligopolies, but this requires well-distributed property. So if you want a free market, you need to have well-distributed property. So I suggest a political agenda, which I lifted from Philip Blond of one of the red Tories, remoralize the markets. We can no longer talk about economics, but about political economy, an economy embedded in moral, ethical, political systems. Relocalize the economy. Okay, this is not anti-trade, but it's certainly anti-globalism. We want the shorter supply chains, shorter distribution chains, more local involvement. And finally, recapitalize the poor. That's what the redistribution of property is all about. Because the basic truth of any economy is that society is lifted from the bottom up, never from the top down. Okay. And with that, I'll stop there and answer
All
any.
right. Are you able to hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Perfect. Okay. I was having technical difficulties earlier, but good. Excellent. I thank you very much for that presentation, and definitely makes my mind go in 1,000 directions. So that's great. I want to turn now to questions from our attendees. And I see we have a couple in the Q&A box already, and please jump in, anyone who's listening and wants to ask something, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. So I'll start with this question. From the point about which goods to produce in the markets and which should be common, how do we make these kinds of determinations?
Sure, that's an excellent question. How do you make a determination on whether, say, and the big question today that is before us is healthcare. But in general, if you take something like roads and police, it would be silly to have you, if you call 911 and give us your MasterCard, that's obviously a case where we want fire protection, police protection. We want that as a common good, not as a market good. Okay. Cell phones. Generally, that should be a market good. You want to spend more on your phone, that's fine. But we've also made a decision that it's also a common good, because you practically cannot get employment today if you do not have a cell phone. Okay, so we have some kinds of phones that are available very cheap or at government supported rates, so that everybody can have a phone. So that's mostly market and a little bit common. Okay. But healthcare is different because it really can't be a market good. I mean, if I'm having a heart attack, I'm in no position to do comparison shopping. And it's a basic good in the sense that everybody has to have it. Okay. So that seems to be more of a candidate for being a common good. So the answer to your question is that there is no fixed answer. It depends on the state of society, the state of technology, where the people are, things like that. So it's a judgment rather than a rule, although there are some rules. But in the end, it's still a political judgment.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Question. So the Pope says in Fratelli Tutti that business activity is essentially a noble vocation directed to producing wealth and improving our world. The right to private property is always accompanied by the primary and prior principle of the subordination of all private property to the universal destination of the earth's goods, and thus the right of all to their use. So we have a two-part question here. One, what should we understand by the universal destination of the earth's goods? And two, how can we couple this challenge with actual demands from business, employees, shareholders, customers, etc.?
Sure. Well, excellent question. Yes, the business is a noble vocation. As a matter of fact, the title of my first book is The Vocation of Business, Social Justice in the Marketplace. It can be, it should be a vocation. Sometimes, and of course, most of the times, I suspect it isn't. It's a way of making a living, and that's okay. I don't criticize that, but that's less than what it can be. Um, so how should you relate private property to the universal destination of goods? That's a tough question to answer. At the extremes, you can answer it when there is dire need, and this is the way Thomas Aquinas answered it. When there is dire need, then all property becomes common. So if you are in dire need, you can appropriate, and there's no other way to relieve that need, you can appropriate the property of another, because in Thomas's word, necessity makes all things common. Now, thinking about being in New Orleans during a flood, can you break into the grocery store and steal bread and groceries? Yes, obviously you can. Can you break into that store and steal a big screen TV? Well, no, obviously you can't, because it's been scientifically proven that people, even Americans, can survive for days without television. So again, these don't often come down to rules, some general rules, but the specific cases are not governed by rules, but by judgments. Okay, the application of the moral intelligence to that particular situation.
So that's part of what's been on my mind then as you answer these questions is making those judgments. I mean, it seems like, so our next question, what's the guarantee that by changing the tax structure and the subsidies, et cetera, the goods will actually be equally distributed? And it seems to me that no matter what direction you go, there has to be some sort of government intervention in making these decisions to make things more equally distributed. But then you always have individuals behind that who could have their own agenda. So how do you ensure that what happens is actually equitable and fair?
Yes. Well, you used two words there, and I think we need to make a distinction between equality and equity. Okay. All right. Nobody's seeking equality for the simple, or at least I am not, for the simple reason that effort is never equal. Some work harder, some work smarter, some are more interested, some train themselves better. Those differences, those individual differences must in justice be rewarded. However, when you see the kinds of differences we have today, you can be sure that the system is inequitable. Because an equitable system will have only relative differences between rich and poor. It won't have these absolute gaps that we have today. Okay, so the changing the tax structure won't guarantee it, but will sure encourage it. So when the tax rate was, the marginal tax rate was 93%. And it was in this country in the 50s. The marginal tax rate was 93%. Well, it doesn't make any sense to give the CEO a $100 million bonus if the government's just going to take 93 million. I mean, they just didn't do that. It didn't make any sense to do that. Okay, so that left more money, for investment or for increasing wages. Note that was at a time when America grew faster, GDP grew faster than at any time in our history, okay, excluding wartime. So it's quite compatible with high growth. In fact, I would, the statistics show that we had higher growth rates. There could be a lot of reasons for that, but it certainly is still consistent with high growth rates. So what we can't be sure that it will be equitably distributed, but we can pretty much be sure that it will be more equitably distributed than it is today.
Okay, that's helpful. And then, yeah, we also have a question about the 50s economy, which you were mentioning earlier. So how much was the 50s economy influenced or conditioned by the post-war effect?
Mhm. Yeah, well, it was greatly conditioned by the post-war effect, by the, uh, um, um, and that's especially true during the 50s, but it also continued through the 60s, when Europe was more um, um, of a competitor, was more on its feet. The Americans did something so intelligent after World War II, because it was unprecedented almost in human history. Instead of doing what we did to Germany after World War I and, punishing her, we're going to get those Germans. They built up Germany. They built up France. They built up Britain. They built up Italy. Okay, through the Marshall Plan. And now the Marshall Plan was foreign aid, and people railed, oh, how terrible it is, we're giving all this money to foreigners. It was just the opposite. It was money given to Americans, because what it was credits given to Europeans and Japanese, and Taiwanese, Koreans, to buy American goods. Okay, so by building up the world, we built up ourselves. You see, and there's such a lesson in that, because we always view this in terms of competition,
Mm-hmm.
when we should be reviewing it in terms of cooperation. I say, and if we look at, if we change our lens, not that there isn't, there's competition, relative competition within an absolute absolute cooperation, which, by the way, is the definition of sports. Um, the everybody benefits. A purely competitive system has winners or losers, but a cooperative system, everybody is relatively a winner, just some are more winners than others. So the we can very definitely, we have models of systems that work, of cooperative systems that work. We don't have to invent the wheel. We've been here, and to our credit as Americans, I think, we adopted this system after World War II. Now, the truth is, we were scared to death of the communists, but for whatever reason we did it, and it worked. And what worked then will work now.
All right. So our next question: price is obviously a very limited tool when it comes to determining the value of goods for the individual. A necessary good like water or food, for example, have the same value for everyone, but they're not subjectively appreciated equally simply through pricing. Some people waste what others lack. How do you add need to the supply and demand question?
Boy, that's that is a very deep question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what's the balance there between need and supply and demand? The supply and demand is an allocation system. If you got the money, you get it, and if you don't, you don't. And it sets your equilibrium point at a point where deliberately it will not service everybody. Some are priced out of the market. That's how the supply and demand chart works. So for certain goods, have to be at least relatively common. Some goods have to be absolutely common, like police protection. Some have to be relatively common, like food, clothing, and shelter. All right, and there have to be systems in place that supplement a price system. Okay, some of these systems are charitable systems, but some of them are price support systems. Some of them are income support systems. What that looks like depends on the shape of society. Depends on the strength of local communities, how much of this can be handled at local communities, how much must be funded on a federal or even international level. So these are prudential questions that are only answered for this situation, which may not work in that situation, you see. And there's where the exercise of the moral intelligence comes in. It cannot be answered in, scientifically. It cannot be answered. There is within economics no scientific answer to this question. There's only a moral answer that consults, of course, the science of political economy, but is not sort of captured by it. And so where I can't give you a rule, I'm not really embarrassed by that failure to give a rule, because I don't think a rule works in every case, only works in this case or that case.
Well, that's where principles, I mean, you have to understand what your principles are, and it's not, you can't make these decisions devoid of some structure of principles. Yeah, that's a very good question. Our next question is, how does a small business person build a co-op of other small business persons?
Well, that's a question for which I am the worst person to answer it. Okay, because I teach students and I write books, so those are exactly the people who don't have any real answers. But I know a lot of people who do have real answers, and there are a lot of organizations, the Ohio Employee Ownership Association, Elias Krim, Solidarity Hall. These can put you in touch with people who actually do this, okay, and actually have real answers, which I do not. So there are lots of resources out there to accomplish that, though.
All right, so we have another question about, you touched a little bit on the distribution of healthcare. So what can we do as physicians to apply these principles to universal populations, as medical licenses are more difficult to get, more competition, and healthcare is very segmented by populations, income, and access to healthcare?
Well, now here's that point where I can go into marketing mode and sell my book, okay? Because I do have a chapter on this that I think that applies to the kind of medical system that we have. One problem we have is that we don't have a free market in medicine. We have the worst of socialized medicine and privatized medicine, and it is in no sense a free market. That is, everything is controlled either by licenses or by certificates of needs for hospitals or by patents. And I think all of those have a specific answer. Licenses, well, like any supply and demand question, you need more licenses. And so I suggest a whole range of licenses, from nurse, midwife, nurse practitioner, medical doctor, specialist. There could be other gradations or divisions, but that allows person to alternate practice and schooling, and to develop their skills over time. Okay, so that increases the supply of medical personnel. As far as medicines go, I am totally opposed to the system of intellectual property that we have, of patents and licenses. In my opinion, we can do this with production licenses. That is, you have a company that develops, products, medical products, be it medicines or equipment, whatever. Okay, you can then license that. You cannot get an exclusive manufacturer of that product, but you can license it. And anybody who pays the license fee can also manufacture that product. Okay. Be it a medicine, x-ray machine, whatever it might be. And that then creates business opportunities, creates competition. And then you're looking at who can best manufacture, deliver, service, support that product. Okay, and you pay for the differences with the price. As far as the control of, as far as hospitals, My recommendation is to shift the basis of medicine from the sort of the chemical hospital industrial complex back to guilds. And this is where doctors get together, doctors and other medical practitioners get together to provide their own practices. And these practices can license their own doctors, license their own pharmacists, set their own practice standards, and sell their own services as either, subscription services or fee for service, fee-based services, whatever makes sense in that situation, and shift the power in that industry back down to the actual practitioners, doctors, pharmacists, nurses, etc., by letting them form guilds. And what actually makes it work is insurance. Because you can't practice medicine today without insurance. But individuals, doctors would not buy insurance. The guild would buy insurance. Now the guild says who can and can't. They are the sole judge of their own practice. Okay, they can say who can be a brain surgeon, and who can be a midwife, et cetera, et cetera. And what makes that work is that everybody bears corporate responsibility. So if you appoint somebody as brain surgeon who, because he'll work for $7.25 an hour, and if he kills somebody, you don't sue him, you sue the guild. So you're not going to appoint somebody who's working for $7.25 an hour. You're going to appoint somebody who, in your judgment, is going to protect your patients, but protect his colleagues from lawsuit because he or she is a competent practitioner. And I think these guilds should be able to establish their own hospitals, their own pharmacies, their own education systems, et cetera, et cetera. And that would introduce both competition, but responsibility into the medical system, and vastly expand the supply, okay, and thereby lower the price. So that's the suggestion that I outline in my book.
Yeah, and so we're coming up towards the end of our question and answer time, and I have one question for myself, actually, that I would like to ask before we turn to practical conclusions. And just as an illustration, I served on a federal jury case a couple of summers ago, which was absolutely fascinating, and it was a patent lawsuit. And this was a 2-week trial that had been, I think, 6 or 7 years in the making, and these lawyers who were earning, I don't even know how many $100 an hour. And it was one company that had a patent on a pharmaceutical and was saying that a different pharmaceutical had infringed on the patent. So we spent all of this time and all of this energy arguing this case, and there was so much money at stake. And in the end, we awarded nothing. And that was like a big deal for the jury to say we award absolutely nothing. And thanks for spending all this money. But it made me think that, this is part of probably contributes to why healthcare prices are what they are in our country. But at the same time, I read your chapter where you talked about intellectual property and patents. And I'm just left with the question of is there any place for intellectual property? I know you were saying it's kind of an invented property, but there are certain things that gifts or talents that have been given to certain individuals that are for the common good, but also, they're a place to say, I had that idea, I have some ownership of how that idea is used and who makes money off of that idea.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And those contributions, those individual contributions need to be recognized, okay? And that's, I think, what the production license does. Okay, they still get rich, but they don't eliminate competition. Now, they may not get as rich as they thought they were going to get rich, as they would get rich under an intellectual property regime, but very few do anyway. And in fact, it introduces a problem for research and development, because you may want to research and develop things which don't have quite the same market. I remember, did you ever see a movie called Lorenzo's Oil? Well, it was about just some private citizens working on a very, very limited disease that nobody was going to invest money in, okay? Because there just wasn't a big enough market for it. Through their own research, they came up with at least some partial answers. But today, researchers are only really free to research things which will produce returns in the neighborhood of 1,000 to 2,000%. Okay, nobody, the structure of our investment market in R&D is such that it requires those kinds of high returns. With a distribution license system, what you have is returns over, say, a 20 or 30-year period. So you invent the latest and greatest, you license it out. It provides an income stream, because an R&D outfit isn't going to hit a home run every year. It may hit a home run, it may find a marketable product every other year, every 5th year, every 10th year, but it needs funding every year. Right now, it's dependent upon investors, okay? And these investors want high returns. They almost have to, because you have to invest in 20 to get one. And it's corrupted the universities, because the universities have converted themselves, the research universities have converted themselves into patent farms. What they do is they get the germ of an idea with some original research, okay? And that's what the university stops. It patents it along with the professor, okay? They share a patent, and then they set up a company. And this company sells shares to speculative investors, okay? But the university's out of it at that point, okay? It no longer supports that research because it wants money to support other, to farm other patents. It's a crazy patchwork system that we have. When that corrupts the very idea of the search for truth and knowledge that should be at the heart of a university. Now they're business enterprises with the worst morals you can possibly imagine. So I think this provides, by separating R&D and production, you free R&D to actually pursue things that might not be pursued. They're pursued because the researcher is interested in them. And some researchers actually do that. Some are looking to be billionaires, and some are looking just to research. So it frees them. It cuts the two apart, and I think they should be cut apart: production and development.
Well, thank you very much for that answer, and for your time answering all these questions. I think this has been some great questions and a really stimulating, interesting conversation. So do you have any last practical conclusions for us concretely? I mean, all of these seem like long-term goals and require massive amounts of buy-in and participation to actually bring some of these ideas to light. Where do you start?
Yes, I do. I think because I believe very much in sort of evolution. You start from where you are and you take little steps. And so where are we? Well, we're in the middle of a debate about taxation. And on that debate, I think we weigh in on the side of progressivism. On other debates, we'd weigh in on the side of conservatives. But you look at the situation, and you always try to weigh in on the side of the common good. But just this little step that's politically possible or just a little politically out of reach today, and you publicize that. So things like universal basic income, well, you can think about that. That might be an answer to a good replacement to the welfare system. You might think about land value taxation as a replacement to some tax regimes. You might think about it, as I suggested, might think about charging the users of the transportation system a higher and higher proportion of the costs. You might think about subsidizing or not subsidizing businesses, but at least creating a more healthy business climate by lowering of globalization, at least the kind of globalization that we have. So there's lots of steps that can be taken. What it can never be, and what I think as a distributist, what I see too often, and it gets on my nerves, is that this is an answer for 100 years from now, but today we can be whatever we are, and usually that means being dedicated capitalists in the present, but in the future we'll have this wonderful distributist society. Well, no, we won't. Not unless we take these little baby steps today. Okay. That's pretty much all.
Perfect. That's a perfect answer. Do what you can.
Where you are with what you got.
Yep. No, that's wonderful. And I want to, again, thank you. And just to kind of segue into the action portion of what we are hoping to do as global responsibility, it's formation, but then, as I said earlier, it's action. So, you just gave us some great suggestions, and I'm hoping that as people are listening, things are starting to stew, ideas are starting to bubble. So I just want to, put it out there. If anyone here tonight, if this talk has sparked something for you, share it. If you have additional ideas on how to engage the culture on these topics, these principles, share it. And we hope as Global Responsibility to offer a platform for that to happen. So we have a couple of ways to do that. One, we have a Slack channel titled Distributism. So that's a way to stay in touch with people who are here. And we are posting the link to that Slack channel in the comments. We have blog posts on our website, so we encourage people to share, to comment on them. We're happy to have guest blog contributors if you feel so inspired. We're going to send around the recording of tonight's webinar and some other resources, invitations to social media channels. So, if this is an issue that stirs you in any way, and you have a network where you just feel compelled to share more, by all means, use these social media platforms to do so within your own networks. And then I also want to encourage, for further reading, check out the rest of our speakers on Madai's book, Toward a Truly Free Market. And Global Responsibility sent a couple of chapters from two of his books when you got the link to tonight's webinar, I believe. So we're happy to send that around again. And thank you, John, for sharing those chapters with us. But definitely look for his books online. There are a number of booksellers that have those available. And let's just stay in touch and keep this conversation going. So just a couple of last things. Again, it's been truly a pleasure to have you, John Madai, tonight. I want to thank you very, very much for being with us, for sharing your insight. And thank you to everyone who came tonight and participated. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. Stay tuned. We have a continuation of the Common Good in the Public Square webinar series. We're working on the next couple of webinars, so stay tuned for more information about the schedule for that and the topics. We've got I promise, very short survey that someone is posting to the chat box on tonight's webinar and how our webinars are arranged in general. So take 30 seconds if you have any feedback. And again, our website has more information about who we are, this webinar series, how to get involved, how to donate if you feel so inspired, and how to stay in touch. So again, I appreciate everyone's participation tonight. I learned a lot. I'm very, very grateful. Thank you to all of the Global Responsibility staff who made this possible. I get to be the face, but there's a lot of behind the scenes people who have done a lot of work to bring this to everyone tonight. So I appreciate that. And I want to wish everyone a wonderful night. Stay in touch, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, and thank you.